All right, so now we're doing video 2 for the weekend of January 27th, 28th, and then 29th for Monday. We're going to move on now from the war breaking out to, we saw the map for the alliances. Now we're moving on to America and how America reacts to all this with our neutrality and so forth. So in World War I, trouble for the U.S. was with belligerent nations trying to prevent supplies from reaching their enemy. So Germany's going to try to stop us from sending shipments to like Britain and France. Britain's going to try to stop us shipping goods to Germany, and we just want to stay neutral. With a strong navy, Britain declared a naval blockade against Germany. So early on when the war broke out, Britain decides that they're going to do a naval blockade of Germany because you see on the map, like Germany's pretty much landlocked. So they want to cut off all supplies going into Germany. Now, traditionally in warfare, you only blockade military goods, and you don't blockade like everything. So they blockade military goods as well as the British blockade military goods. They blockade consumer goods, all kinds of different stuff. And so we're upset by that as well as the Germans. This becomes a big problem for the Germans because as time goes on, as each year passes, the Germans are going to have to decide, what it's going to take to win this war because they're getting cut off from food supplies, they're getting cut off from medical equipment, from clothing. They're not just being cut off from basic weapons, and that's going to be a big problem. But the Germans decide, the British decide to blockade us, and so in those first few months of the war, we're actually probably more upset with the British than we are anybody else because we're just trying to trade, and the British are stopping us, and we're a sovereign nation. Why are you stopping us from trading with Germany? We're not at war with anybody, and so the British were stopping our ships and basically seizing cargo or making us turn around when we just wanted to trade with everybody and be left alone. Wilson protested the blockade that Britain put on as a violation of neutral rights and freedom of the seas. So Wilson does protest this as a violation of neutral rights and freedom of the seas as a result. So anyway, but our feeling is going to quickly change because of what the Germans end up doing. So the Germans end up doing submarine warfare to kind of counteract this. So this is the Germans' counter-blockade. Because because the British were blockading Germany with their ships and with their mines and those kind of things, the Germans don't have a massive navy, they have a lot of submarines. So the Germans had developed a big submarine fleet to go basically after any ship trying to trade with Britain or France. So as early as 1915, you have German subs going out there trying to fire upon any ship that they suspect is trying to help out Britain or France. So this is the German counter-blockade. So this eventually affects us because you have a ship sank called the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a passenger ship. In fact, it was a sister ship to the Titanic. So Lusitania was a sister ship to Titanic. So it's a giant cruise ship, basically. People traveling across the ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. They're not a military boat. But they sank that ship, and on board the ship, they killed basically everybody on board, including 128 Americans. So on May 7th, 1915, 128 Americans were killed on board the Lusitania, which obviously makes a lot of Americans very anti-German and are now clamoring to go to war as a result too. So a lot of Americans become very anti-German and are now clamoring to go to war as well. So these submarines attack us. Oh, and by the way, their submarines were called U-boats, or as it's short for Unterseeboot. So U-boats or Unterseeboats were attacking British and French ships at sea, and including killing Americans at sea too. So anyway, the reason why they attacked the ship is because they accused the British of smuggling weapons from America to Britain to help them win the war. And America and Britain both denied this. They said we were not secretly hauling weapons across the ocean to help these guys out. Well, surprisingly, or probably not surprisingly, years later, we do archaeology, and guess what was on board? Weapons. And so the weapons on board actually helped the ship sink faster. When they torpedoed the ship, it hit those munitions and made the ship explode and sink a lot faster as a result. So anyway, as a result of all this, Wilson responded by sending Germany a strongly worded message to warn Germany they'd be held accountable if they continue to attack neutral ships at sea. And Wilson, and so obviously Wilson doesn't go to war because he wants to maintain neutrality, but his Secretary of State, William James Bryan, thought that that was too warlike of a message, and so he resigned over it. That's whenever Bryan decides to resign, only 2 years into the administration, because he felt like Wilson was being too aggressive with his points of view. So Germany relents. They basically pledge to stop the attacks and to give warning before it happens, and so no major attack happens again, and no Americans get attacked at sea going forward. A year later, you're going to have some more sinkings take place. In August of 1915, 2 more Americans died on another passenger ship as a result of U-boat attacks. Wilson's note of protest did get the German government to pledge no more passenger ships sunk without warning. But Germany only kept its word for so long, because here's Germany's problem. Germany is in a bad situation because the British have cut off all their supplies, food, clothing, all that stuff. So they're getting, every year that goes by, they're getting more desperate, because every year that goes by, people are going to begin to starve. In fact, like in 1917 alone, you're going to have like tens of thousands of Germans starve because of what's happening in the war. And so all Germany is trying to do is basically create the same conditions as Britain, basically destroying any kind of supplies Britain may get to help their people survive this war. And so that's the reason why they continue to break their pledges. So anyway, the German government kept its word until an unarmed merchant ship was attacked, the Sussex, which brings us to the next item, the Sussex. So this French ship was attacked, the Sussex, in the summer of 1916. I'm sorry, not summer, March of 1916, with some Americans injured. So no Americans were killed on board, and the people actually got off the ship okay, but again, Germany's attacking these unarmed ships, and America wants it to stop. So after the Sussex got attacked, Wilson threatened to cut off diplomatic ties, which is usually the first step towards going to war with somebody. So in 1916, Germany issues what's called the Sussex Pledge. This is something you want to have down. It's a promise to not sink any merchant or passenger ships without giving a warning first. So the Sussex Pledge is where Germany pledges to not sink any merchant or passenger ship without giving a warning first. Basically, you give them a warning to get to their lifeboats first before they get sunk. Because they might still sink the ship to prevent weapons and supplies going to Britain, but they let the people get off first. This will prove difficult for Germany to stay true to, because as we get closer to 1917, Germany's becoming more desperate, and they're losing people based on starvation and whatnot. Okay, the economic links with Britain and France. So America was officially neutral on paper, but our economy became closer tied to Britain and France. Before the war broke out, we traded with Britain, we traded with France and Germany. We probably traded more with Britain than anybody else, but we traded with everybody. But now we want to trade with Germany, but we couldn't. Even though we were upset at first in the first few years of the year or so of the war that we couldn't trade with Germany because we made money off those guys, Britain and France began to increase their trade with us. And so within the first 3 years of that war, we quadruple our trade with Britain and France, because they basically come to us to buy all kinds of weapons and supplies and goods and so forth, food and so on. So over time, we just stopped caring the fact that we don't trade with Germany anymore. So at first we were upset we didn't trade with Germany, but over time we just don't care, because as time goes on and we have making more money than we ever did before with Britain and France, it's like, who cares? So by 1915, U.S. businesses had never been so prosperous with all our trade with Britain and France. So we were technically neutral, but we were definitely making a lot of money off of Britain and France's trade. The U.S. could have shipped to Germany too, but the blockade prevented such trade. Over time, Wilson more or less tolerated the British blockade while restricting German subs. So we were upset about it at first, but over time we kind of got over it and didn't really do anything about it. So American support was really only one-sided, by 1917. And then on top of that, which is going to come back to bite us later on, is the loans. That Wilson authorized American businesses and banks to give loans to Britain and France during the war. And this is going to be a problem because, it's peacetime, we're supposed to be neutral, and, we do allow them to as long as they have all the, proper stuff done, they can get loans from us. But it makes us less neutral, because think about it like this. The more we invest money into Britain and France, then we're going to want to see that money come back to us. And so 3 years into this war, by 1917, we definitely are kind of on Britain and France's side, because if they lose this war, then we lose all that loan money from Britain and France. So those loans were very important because we want to make sure that we get that money back eventually, which makes us thus therefore less neutral. So the trade we have with Britain and France and the loans we give them make us less neutral over time. So bankers like J.P. Morgan and other bankers give over $3 billion in money to Britain and France in those 3 years we're at peace before we jump in the war. But they do help to maintain the Allied war effort against Germany. Okay, so we're going to wrap up here with public opinion, then we'll stop with this slide. The attitudes of Americans generally favored Britain because of our common ancestry. So most Americans favor the British side of things, and France because we're democracies, and us and Britain go back a long time. We have a shared culture and language and so forth. The Germans were kind of painted as this ruthless bunch who invaded Belgium even though they were neutral, and essentially, Germans came out to seem a lot more mean-spirited and so forth. Plus, they were run by a king or a monarch called Kaiser Wilhelm II. Kaiser spelled K-A-I-S-E-R, Kaiser being a title, like an emperor title. Wilhelm is W-I-L-H-E-L-M, II. So the Germans were made to seem much more mean-spirited and much more aggressive from the get-go. But, here's the thing with World War I. This is the big difference between World War I and like World War II and everything else. That World War I, like every other war before this, is controversial. Not everybody supports going to war with either side, because in reality, both sides are just as guilty. Why is Germany fighting? Well, because they were allies with one country. Why is Britain and France fighting? Because they're allies. So really, Germany's not doing anything more crueler or worse than what Britain and France are doing. But over time, it appears that we take the British side anyway. But don't think like this is like World War I, where like the Germans are like the Nazis and they're definitely bad guys. In World War I, you could go either way. Because World War II, it's obvious who the bad guys are. World War I, that's not so obvious. So there's a lot of ethnic influence over who takes whose side in America. By 1914, 30% of the population was either first or second born generation immigrant in America. So in 1914, 30% of the U.S. population was either first or second generation immigrant, which means that whatever country they came from is usually the one they supported in World War II. Everybody was glad to be neutral and stay out the fighting, but they did sympathize with their home countries. So, like the Italians will cheer for the Allied forces whenever they join the Allied forces in 1915. German Americans obviously cheer for the Central Power side. And the Irish will cheer for the Central Powers because the Irish hate the British. The Irish, for a long time, going back and deep in their history, they hate the British. And so because basically whoever the British are fighting, that's who they pull for. So the Irish Americans and the German Americans were ones who pulled mostly for the Central Powers here in the United States. But the vast majority of Americans pull for the British and French side because of our common culture, heritage, and languages and democracies and so forth. And by the way, I don't know if I told you this or not, I think it's Allied powers and Central Powers. I'm sorry if I skipped over that, but the Allied powers are Britain, France, Russia. Central Powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary. And it makes sense, like Central Powers obviously being here in the center, and then the rest of us are Allied powers. I'm sorry if I skipped over that earlier. But what probably influences us the most, besides all the trade and the loans and those kind of things, is the fact that the British give us most of the war information, that they give us a lot of propaganda. Most of the information that came from Europe came from the British, which basically means that whatever news we heard, it was always going to be good about the British and the French and bad about the Germans. So the British were very good about making sure that all war news that came to us were propagandized to the point to where we believe that the British and the French were doing nothing wrong and the Germans were doing cruel things. When in reality, the British and the Germans and the French, they were all doing the same kind of stuff in the war. And so the British recognized the value of American public opinion and made sure to report only on things that benefited them and made Germany look bad. And that's kind of what's going on here. So we're not the best people either in terms of neutrality. Like we were supposed to not be secretly selling weapons to either side. And as you see in this cartoon, we were secretly selling weapons to the British side. So we weren't being as good as we were supposed to be either. And but obviously our neutrality was not really authentic. And even though we're saying, hey, we're trying to be neutral, we're not really trying to be neutral in general. But that's where we're going to stop, and we'll pick up there probably Tuesday or Wednesday.